Spoiler warning. This is your spoiler warning for episode 8. We talk about the final episode of season 14 of Supernatural and the last 3 episodes of the final season, season 15. We're talking major spoilers here if you haven't seen the finale. I'll try to add some timestamps of when plot-heavy spoilers are discussed, but you've been warned. The ways we produce and consume television has shifted a lot in the last 10 years. Sure, that's obviously true. But I think the biggest shift has occurred in the last 5 years. Workers' strikes by writers, actors, and crew have all been attempts to push back against shrinking job prospects and the disappearance of journeyman-level roles where newcomers can develop their craft. But the hardest shift probably came in 2020. Thanks to the COVID-19 virus and resulting pandemic that froze work across almost every sector, except healthcare providers and other actually essential roles, the lockdowns, attempts at reopening, and the implementation of safety procedures affected every aspect of our lives. This week, we're talking about a particularly tumultuous show ending, Supernatural. In addition to all the usual struggles that come with the when and how to end a show, and how fans will take it, Supernatural had the misfortune of having filming of their final 2 episodes interrupted by the arrival of COVID in spring 2020. If you're a part of the SPN family, then I'm sure much of this is old news for you. Especially if you were watching live during the final season. Then you absolutely remember the sudden shutdown and uncertainty that an ending would be made at all. When I spoke to Richard Speight Jr., actor and director of season 15, episode 18, Despair, he commented on how often Supernatural conventions include someone stepping up to the microphone to ask his opinion on the show's conclusion, and how COVID is inevitably tied to it.
I won't weigh in on whether I liked it or not because I don't think my opinion matters in this scenario. I'm too close to the family. But I'll say, as a human who lived during that time and as a director myself, their hands were tied behind their back. This is COVID. So I tell people who will get up at the microphone and ask about this and have disparaging comments about it, I say, well, be glad there was one. There was a finale to even talk about now, because odds were there wasn't going to be one. The series was just going to be done because TV shows couldn't figure out a way to shoot and stay within the COVID guidelines and still afford to shoot because of all the new restrictions and money and people housing in hotel rooms for 14 days where they go to work. It was just logistically so weird and different and unlike anything anybody's ever tackled. Got to stay 5 feet away from the camera, 5 feet away from each other, masks and shields and everything while you're working, skeleton crew, not standing near each other. It's a miracle anything got shot. So the fact that Supernatural turned out anything to sort of put, if not a closed door, like at least a sort of almost shut window on the series is fortunate, because the odds were nothing was going to happen.
I did try to push and see if he thought the finale lived up to expectations. But Rich pointed out that it's impossible to separate the end of the series with the broader context of the world. AKA, COVID affected everything.
That's because the tools in the toolbox weren't available to tell the story from a writing standpoint, from a shooting standpoint. So how could they deliver at their highest level if they were hindered so dramatically by outside forces out of their control?
Rich was first introduced to Supernatural in the role of the Trickster back in season 2. He stuck around, reprising his role several times across the seasons, and also developing his skills as a director.
Directed 11 episodes. That's a good chunk of episodes, and in one season I did 5. So in one season of Supernatural, I did a quarter of the episodes. So it was an impactful experience for me in a massive way. And there's a lot of people who helped me with that, who were not new to their jobs like I was, who were veterans of their department, who recognized my newness and went the extra mile to make sure I was going to succeed, and went beyond the scope of their assignment when I needed them to, out of inexperience or ignorance or some combination thereof, as I was getting my sea legs under me as a director. And those people deserved my gratitude.
But then COVID shut down productions. Even when Supernatural started filming again for the penultimate and final episodes, COVID distancing and guides were strictly enforced to maintain the health and safety of the cast and crew. Where before, it wouldn't have been surprising to see folks around set and get a drink after shooting for the day, they now had to stick to a quarantine protocol.
I mean, there's crew people I'll never see again that I would have loved to have said thank you to, that I would love to have, maybe I wouldn't have seen him at a wrap party even, but I would have had a quote unquote last day on set, and I would have gone around and made sure to speak to people who had had an influence on my journey and on the show itself, to say, man, your work is awesome and thank you. And it's been a treat and a pleasure. And I look forward to the next time. That's the part that bummed me out the most.
It wasn't like Rich would never see anyone from the show again. There are still conventions after all.
I knew I'd see Jared again. I knew I'd see Jensen again and Misha. And I knew I'd see Bob Singer and Phil Zagrisha and the core team and Brad Greaser and people with whom I'd become good friends. But there are some people that you work alongside who are invaluable, who are essential, and you are watching them do their job every day in prep and in shooting as a director, and so they're invaluable. There's no mystery to you. They're kicking ass and building the set and rigging the pulls and doing all the things that have to be done to make the show awesome. And so you're just looking forward to buying them a beer and say thanks. And when that goes away, it may seem small, but it's not small at all. It's massive. They're the ones who make the machine work. And I would like to have been able to let them know how much it meant to me to be a part of their world and to benefit from their skill. And so that will always bug me. That will always be something that I'm sad about. But it's not my grandmother dying alone. It's a first world COVID problem.
I really appreciated Rich talking about the importance of the crew behind Supernatural. Fans may know the names of all the lead actors, but how many know who the camera B operator was? Or the name of the gaffers? Or what a gaffer is? FYI, the gaffer is the chief lighting technician and is responsible for the execution of the lighting plan for production. Shout out to the gaffer on the series finale, Chris Cochran. But like any good fan, I really wanted to get into the details of Rich's work on season 15, episode 18.
You mentioned Despair, that episode that I directed. That was the last episode to be directed normally, to be shot normally, pre-COVID. Everything else after that was a post-COVID world. So I do feel blessed I was able to finish up my episode. And the day I was finishing was one of those days when Arrow closed down and Riverdale closed down. And, Craig, one of our producers, kept coming down, our UPM, and was going to be like, we kept thinking, oh, here he comes to shut us down. But he wasn't, but everybody was on high alert. Tensions were high. People were confused. The world was in flux.
Just imagining how cast and crew tensed up anytime the unit production manager walked by. The ratcheting up of that anxiety as folks heard how schools and workplaces were closing and how other sets were shutting down. I feel like that very real anxiety and sense of a timer counting down ended up reflected in the episode.
The last thing I shot for that episode was, or one of the last things was Brianna's character dying and all those characters dying in the bunker, little kids and parents and all that stuff. And it was like, yeah, it was just a trip.
As a reminder, Brianna Buckmaster played Sheriff Donna Hanscom, a fellow hunter in Supernatural. In despair, her character, along with nearly everyone else on the planet, save a few special exceptions, disappears with the snap of Chuck's fingers. Although fans like myself might fixate on the dungeon scene with Dean, Cass, and Death, Richard focused on the global stakes that the episode set up for the penultimate episode.
There's like a moment where everybody's dying in the bunker, and that one was, I thought, painful. There's you killing a little kid, and I put the kid in there. I wanted to be sure we had a child, because that resonates with people.
Okay, but I won't leave you hanging in suspense. I obviously asked Rich about the dungeon scene and his experience filming Misha Collins's farewell to Castiel.
It was written to be impactful, and we worked really hard. Obviously, the real shoe leather falls to Misha and then Jensen to act out that scene specifically. But Bob Behrens teed him up with a great script, and I did my best, worked really hard in lockstep with Misha and Jensen to serve their story as a director, to give them the runway they needed. And it was a impactful thing to witness firsthand. Really great acting and meaningful moment. And I was glad to be there for it, and I was glad to be the director for it, because I felt like, because I was an inside player and knew the story and the team and the two actors really well, that I could help them. I could set them up for success. They were going to crush this regardless. They're great actors, but there are ways to maximize that and ways to impede it, and I think I was able to maximize it for them.
But Richard Speight Jr. wasn't the only Supernatural alum I interviewed about the finale and the COVID-ness of it all. I also spoke with God himself, aka Rob Benedict, about his experience as the ultimate big bad and how filming changed with COVID-19 nearly totally shutting down production. We started our conversation with what it felt like to learn that the lead actors had decided to call 15 the final season.
I'm friends with Jared and Jensen, the leads on that show, and they, really came from them. I mean, they just decided. I mean, I think that network would have kept going. Yeah, I think that show was such a well-oiled machine. It could have kept going. I think the boys were like, you know what, we're gonna clear 300 episodes. We've done it. It's been a great run. Let's call it. While we're feeling great about it.
When season 15 was announced as the conclusion of the series, Rob didn't know if his character would be making an appearance or what his role might look like.
At the end of the last episode of the 14th season, I read the episode, and in the episode I turned bad. And I didn't know until I got the episode and read it, oh my God, I'm going to be hated. This is awful. And then I find out that their plan is, I'm going to be the big bad of the final season. Then I was kind of excited, But no, I literally am turning the pages, having the reaction that fans must have had when they watched it. Why am I acting weird? I'm acting kind of funny, And then you're like, oh my God, I've gone bad.
For anyone who has met Rob at a convention, you can probably guess what a shock this was for him. His initial introduction to the world of Supernatural was as the bumbling but well-meaning prophet Chuck Shirley. Once his character was revealed to be God in disguise as a prophet, his character changed and grew across the seasons. But this particular about-face was a surprise even for Rob.
I mean, my first reaction was very similar to reactions that I think fans had, because I've been told, where I'm like, oh no, like what's my problem? I used to like myself. Uh, but then, yeah, as an actor, it was super exciting to get that news that like, oh, you're the big bad of the final season. It was great. I mean,
And for a show that has already defeated monstrous leviathans, demons, the existential force that is the darkness, and the devil Lucifer several times, well, you can tell why the only way to up the stakes is to truly pit free will versus divine power by making Chuck the ultimate villain.
what better big bad guy for the guys to go up against than God, itself. So, it's I thought that was really cool that that's their final hurdle is God. And so yeah, ultimately it was a real big honor to be able to be there for that, do that.
Especially considering the metatextual relationship that Supernatural has always had with its fans and creators. Episodes over the seasons had often made jokes about Chuck's role as the writer of the Supernatural book series. So giving the show writers the avatar of Chuck/God made for a unique plot twist for the final season, almost pitting the writing staff against their creation in some weird metaphysical way. But we're not here to talk about the choice of God as the final baddie. No, we're here to talk about how COVID rewrote parts of the ending more than Chuck or any of the show writers could have ever expected.
As a writer, it's the hardest thing in the world. How do you end a 15-season show in a way that everybody goes, it was great? People usually don't like endings. People seem to like the penultimate episode, the second last episode, when they finally kill me, or they take the God out of me, I suppose, and put it in the character of Jack. They seem to like that one. It seemed like a good finish. And then the final episode, we got in trouble with because of COVID, and that ruined the plan.
Filming made it through 18 of the final season's episodes before the pandemic hit. But when it was time to film 19, new COVID restrictions in both the United States and Canada, where the show was filmed, were being formed.
It was like the night before I was supposed to fly up for 19. And I was like, the morning of the day before I was supposed to fly, I sent an email. I was like, am I still flying? Like, what's happening? And they're like, yeah, as far as we know, you're still flying. It's, all systems go. Okay. And then that night I got an email like, don't go to the airport. It's not happening. We're shutting down. Like, oh man. Okay. And then we went through the same thing we all went through. It was COVID and lockdown and the craziness that was. And then 5 months later, Supernatural was the first show to go back of all the shows on TV. So there were not even like rules in place.
Eventually, new restrictions around quarantining and testing were implemented for anyone crossing the border.
Those last two episodes were done in lockdown. And so like even when I had to go up for the second last episode, I had to be in quarantine for 10 days and all. It was a big, expensive deal for production. So it really kind of could have put a kibosh on that final episode. And so it was made with sort of one hand tied behind the back. And it just wasn't I don't think it wasn't as epic as it was planned to be. That being said, I think they did a good job with what they had.
With the expense of housing actors and crew for 10 days before any work could even begin, it's clear why the last few episodes had to be completed with a skeleton crew.
These crew members that literally we had the same crew members for 15 years. Like there were lots of people that stayed on that show. So it was a bummer to, have it all end. And some of these people I may not see again for a long time. And like it was all masks and waves as opposed to hugs and, handshakes. So that part of it was a bit of a bummer, and we really were literally in a bubble. I mean, we literally couldn't, it was me and Jake Abel and Jensen and Jarrett were like the actors in that episode. And we were all quarantining at the same time, so we would Zoom each other at night. It was such a unique situation. We'd Zoom each other from our lockdown spaces and
Zoom. I'm glad to know I wasn't the only one desperately holding onto my sanity with Zoom happy hours and the occasional Jackbox game night in 2020. I got really good at some of those trivia games. Anyways, For the cast and crew, spending 10 days cooped up in a motel wasn't just boring. For the CW, it was also very expensive, which meant that the original plan for the final shot in the final episode had to go through some major rewrites.
I remember Jensen pitched the ending to me. Well, he just told me what it was going to be, but he did it in the Jensen Ackles way, where he really like animates it and tells you what it's. And it seemed incredible. I was like, this is gonna be the best ending ever. This final episode of Supernatural was going to be this really cool thing. Like I said, the writers were fans of breaking the fourth wall in that show, and the end of the show was supposed to be, spoiler alert, like Jensen's character dies, and then you go through Sam's life, and at the end, Sam dies, he goes to heaven, and everyone from the show that was beloved is there in this bar hanging out. Everyone who would be in heaven, characters who would be in heaven, are hanging out. And we were all going to go back up to Vancouver for this. We had all booked rooms, everything. And then the sort of literally wall was going to open, and the rest of us, because I wouldn't have been in that room as sort of the bad guy, but the rest of us, characters like me and Rowena and Richard Speight, like these characters, we were all going to be there almost as ourselves with glasses of champagne, and we were all going to have this wrap party on camera. Like, as sort of credits rolled, you get to see everybody from the show. We all have loved each other, and we all done the conventions together, so it would have been a great reunion. None of that because of COVID.
If you're wondering what changed and what elements remained the same, Season 15 showrunner Andrew Dabb has a quote in the Supernatural crew members' souvenir book on the end of the series. Read here by my husband, Daniel.
We originally had a different ending for the Supernatural finale. Dean was always going to end up in heaven, and we were always going to see Sam's life and fast forward. But those final moments were supposed to take place somewhere else. When Bob Singer and I sat down to talk about Season 15 and our inevitable end, we came up with something that felt like a fitting version of Sam and Dean's heaven. All the people the boys had met along the way, or at least those we can convince to fly to Vancouver, crowded into a rebuilt roadhouse as the band Kansas played our unofficial theme song. And that was our plan, right until mid-March. Jerry Wanick and his crew built an amazing set, the last in 15 years of awesome, inspired work, but then COVID struck. We shut down. And when we opened back up in August, getting that many people in an enclosed space, much less traveling some of our favorites from LA and making them quarantine 2 weeks for what would be half a day's work, just wasn't realistic. Even Kansas, always game, didn't feel like they could make that trip, which we completely understood. And so, that Supernatural ending ended. I love what we have now, Dean in the car, on the open road, but I have to admit that sometimes I think about our original idea. All of Sam and Dean's family and friends, and one of the greatest rock bands ever on a masterpiece of a set, and I miss it, even though it never really existed. I miss what could have been.
Hearing Rob and Andrew Dabb describe the planned ending, I get why this would have felt like the proper send-off for the series. Supernatural fans talk about the SPN family for a reason, after all. It's not just the fans that become friends, but all the cast and crew, many of whom spent over a decade working closely with each other.
But yeah, it was a bummer. Everyone was a little bit like, because it was like 326 episodes or whatever. It's all leading to this. 2 episodes before they're done, the plug gets pulled.
Imagine working with a close group of friends for a good chunk of your professional career, getting really excited to celebrate your hard work, and then just poof. No wrap party, no tearful farewells, no chance to have the send-off that such a massive undertaking deserves. Yeah, that feels like more than just a bummer. Then again, I'm just glad we got an ending at all.
And I can't stress enough that unfortunately this doesn't count when you're looking back at a show, but it was really hard to make. It was hard to pull that off. And so as as part of the machine that makes it, I just go like, wow, we did it. We were able to pull that off. So, but I can see if you're just watching it from home, it's super easy to be a critic, and I try to remember that if I'm watching a show where like, this isn't for me. Like it still was so much time was put into that, to making that. You have to respect that with every show.
So I think Rob and Richard had a lot of insight into how filming during COVID was such a unique challenge and disrupted the show's ending from the planned farewell. But it wasn't just the show's filming that was impacted. Reception of the series finale was also deeply affected by the COVID lockdown.
Obviously, with the ending, it was so controversial around Destiel. And because that was always one of the biggest, things that people would argue about or latch onto, the show ending in that way was always going to cause drama, especially because it was alleged that the ending that they ended up with Castiel wasn't necessarily going to be the ending had COVID not happened, with him not being there in the final episodes and things. And so it gave fans, this kind of continued frustration and anger and something to latch onto.
You may remember this voice as Dr. Georgia Carroll, last heard in episode 4, talking about her research on fandom and celebrity studies.
But also there was a sense of frustration around what could have been had it not been for COVID. And that's frustrating because there is no way to know for sure.
Fans were well aware that COVID had affected shooting. More information has come out over the years about the exact impacts COVID had on the conclusion, but many fans at the time were blaming every part of the last few episodes that they didn't like on the coronavirus. That said, Georgia, like Lynn in the previous episode's discussion, didn't think there would ever be a way to please all fans.
I think on the one hand, you're never going to appease the whole fandom because the whole fandom has never been appeased about anything in its life.
Not only did COVID stress the show's production, the fans were going through it too, which could have unavoidably soured everyone's attitudes as well.
The ending happened at a time where they were really vulnerable because of COVID and everyone's emotions were, everyone was a mess in 2020. And so for people who had watched the show as an outlet for a lot of mental health stuff, and that's kind of people will talk quite openly about that on in the online fandom spaces, and that as a reason why they want to keep meeting the actors because it gives their life a sense of meaning. For the show to kind of have such a disappointing ending, I think it really impacted them.
It was already going to be a difficult moment for fans who had grown up with the show. To see it end after 15 years with Sam and Dean, 12 with Castiel, yeah, of course that was going to be hard. But with the real world looking so uncertain at the time, some fans felt like they needed their comfort show more than ever.
You feel let down by it. And I think that feeling was amplified because of how messy the world was and continues to be, but was in 2020. So I think, again, there was that kind of just a stacking of elements that kind of set Supernatural up for a perfect storm of a messy ending.
Not that the world has gotten less messy since then, just different messy. I wasn't one of the fans watching live in 2020. I was too busy finishing my dissertation and then desperately hunting for a job while also rescheduling my wedding. I can't even tell you what I was watching back then. Was it Star Trek Voyager? Maybe Community? Anyways, I'm just saying I didn't share in that particular fandom experience. But I can imagine how watching live from lockdown could have added extra weight to the finale experience. and it left fans divided. But, as Rich said,
I'm glad people are still talking about it. I don't get on the debates and read the boards, but I don't do my job to not have an impact. You know, like I want it to have an impact. That's the point.
next time on In Defense of Fandom. Show resurrections, reboots, and fan euthanasia. How do you bring a show back and keep it true to the original? What makes one reboot, like Battlestar Galactica, a success, while others flail and flame out? See you in 2 weeks. Editorial support was provided by Dr. Anna Funk. Music was composed and performed by Chris Scott. Cover art was designed by Liz Hand. In Defense of Fandom was made possible through an unhealthy obsession and your support via Ko-fi. Thanks especially to Meg B, Catalanta, and Tiff for supporting this season of the pod. If you're not already supporting the show and you'd like to, you can find a link in the show notes to our Ko-fi. A one-time donation of any amount will get you access to behind-the-scenes content, including the audio of some of my full conversations with this season's guests, including Richard Speight Jr. If you can't support the show financially, giving it a review on Apple Podcast is a great way to help support this work. Your support is deeply appreciated.
Dab quote. Read by Daniel?
Read and read are spelled the same way, you child.
I read by Daniel is how I read it. Dab quote. Read by Daniel? We originally had a different ending for Supernatural finale. Dean was always going to end up in heaven, and
take it from the beginning.
I am the talent here. I put my own spin on it.
Go back.
A potato flying around a room.
Perfect. That was actually way better. That was the level I wanted.
A potato flew around. Ding, 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 ding. You have to include that. You have to include my going ding, ding, ding,
That's
ding,
gonna be the end of
ding.
the episode. As the music fades out, it's just gonna be you going.
Ding, and then singing. A potato flew around my room.